Steam curled from the cup, the bitter smell of burned coffee filling the air. At a small diner off the highway, a black woman sat quietly by the window, her hands folded, her eyes lowered, doing what she always did, minding her own business. That's when he walked in. A uniformed cop, loud, entitled. His gaze fell on her, and in an instant the air shifted. With a smirk he swaggered closer, his cup in hand. Without a word, he tilted it forward. Hot coffee spilled down her blouse, staining the fabric, searing her skin. The diner fell silent. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She simply looked up, calm but unshaken. He had no idea who she was, and even less idea who she had raised. Her name was Elaine Carter. To most, she was invisible. A woman who lived on the quiet edges of town, who rarely demanded attention, and who never allowed the world to see how deeply it had scarred her. She worked nights at the county library, sorting shelves when the building was empty, whispering to herself as though the books were her only company. By day, she kept to her small home on Willow Street, a modest place with peeling paint and an old oak tree that shaded the porch. Elaine wasn't born timid. She had once been full of fire, but years of subtle jabs and stares had pressed her into silence. At the grocery store, clerks spoke over her as though she wasn't standing at the counter. At the bus stop, people clutched their bags tighter when she stepped near. Even in church, where grace should have ruled, she felt the shift of pews as people left space between themselves and her skin. It was never loud, never blatant. It was 1,000 whispers of rejection that piled into something heavier than stone. What most didn't know was that Elaine was a mother. Her son, Marcus Carter, had grown beyond the narrow town lines that tried to confine her. He had left home with a scholarship and a determination forged by the quiet resilience of the woman who raised him. In college, Marcus found his voice. He studied law, driven not by the hunger for power, but by the memory of watching his mother's silence forced upon her. He had sworn he would never let her dignity, or anyone else's, be trampled without consequence. Elaine rarely spoke of Marcus. Pride lived in her heart, but she kept it hidden like a delicate flame, afraid the world would try to snuff it out. She collected his letters in a wooden box under her bed, reading them over when the nights felt longest. "Mom," one of them said, "you taught me patience, but you also taught me strength. One day, I'll show the world where I learned it." It was on a Sunday morning that everything began to shift. Elaine walked into the diner like she had countless times before. The bell above the door jingled. The scent of bacon, biscuits, and weak coffee floated through the air. The same faces sat in the same booths, staring at the same menus they always did. Elaine ordered her usual tea with lemon, and took a seat by the window, her favorite spot where the sunlight softened the room. At the counter, the door opened. The uniform came first, gleaming badge catching the light. Officer Randall Pierce. To the town he was authority wrapped in arrogance. To Elaine, he was just another shadow in a long list of men who looked at her and saw less than human. Pierce was known for flexing his power when eyes were on him. He liked being the center of attention, liked to remind everyone that his word carried weight. That morning, his eyes scanned the diner until they landed on her. Something shifted in his smirk, a silent decision that the quiet woman in the corner would become his stage. He sauntered forward, holding his coffee cup, the steam curling like a warning. People turned to watch, not because they expected kindness, but because they had seen him before. Some leaned in. Some looked away. No one spoke. Elaine didn't move. Her hands rested on the table, still, calm, almost fragile. She had faced storms before. But in that moment, she didn't know the storm about to come would not end in her silence. When the coffee poured down her blouse, when heat seared her skin and the stain spread across her chest, Elaine inhaled sharply, but did not flinch. A hush fell over the diner. Pierce leaned closer, his lips curling into a whisper meant only for her. "Accidents happen, don't they?" Elaine lifted her gaze, eyes steady, voice unshaken. She said nothing. Silence, once her burden, became her weapon. What Pierce could not know, what none of them could, was that her silence was not weakness. It was preparation. Because Elaine had raised a son who was no longer silent, a son who would soon hear of this moment, a son whose name was already echoing through courtrooms and headlines far beyond this small, dusty town. And in that silence, the first thread of consequence began to unravel. The stain on Elaine's blouse dried into a dark mark, but the burn lingered on her skin. She dabbed it with a napkin, her movements gentle, deliberate. Not a word left her lips. Officer Pierce, satisfied with his cruelty, chuckled under his breath and strutted back to the counter, as though nothing had happened. To him, it was just another small act of domination, something to fuel his pride. To Elaine, it was another scar layered atop a lifetime of quiet wounds. But this time, the silence didn't stay contained. A waitress, young, nervous, no older than 20, had seen the entire thing. Her hands shook as she refilled a coffee pot, her eyes darting between Elaine and the officer. She wanted to speak, but fear choked her. She had grown up in this town too, knew the rules authority always wins, and black voices are easily dismissed. Yet, something about Elaine's stillness unsettled her. It was not defeat. It was the calm before a reckoning. By afternoon, whispers spread beyond the diner walls. Did you hear what Pierce did? He poured it on her. Just like that. She didn't even react. The town had seen Elaine for years, moving quietly through its streets, but this incident caught fire because people recognized something in her composure, a dignity so strong it turned cruelty into spectacle. Elaine returned home, washed her blouse, and pressed it carefully as if restoring it restored her too. That night, she opened the box beneath her bed and reread Marcus's letters. One line glowed like a beacon. Mom, when injustice comes, don't carry it alone. Let me fight it with you. She folded the letter and held it against her chest. Marcus was no longer just her son. He was Attorney Marcus Carter, a rising figure in civil rights law, known for challenging police misconduct across the state. His name carried weight, his voice carried power, and his cases had begun to shift conversations in courtrooms that once echoed only with indifference. When Marcus called the next evening, Elaine hesitated at first. She never liked to trouble him with her pain. But the moment he heard her silence, he pressed gently, "Mom, what happened?" And in a low, steady tone, she told him. The phone line went cold for a moment. Then his voice returned firm, sharpened by fury. "Hey, poured hot coffee on you. In public, and nobody stopped him." Elaine tried to soften it. "It's just coffee, Marcus. I've dealt with worse." Marcus would not allow it. "No, Mom. It's not just coffee. It's humiliation. It's violence. And it's exactly the kind of abuse I fight against every day. He picked the wrong woman. He picked my mother." The escalation began quickly. By the end of the week, Marcus was in town. He didn't come quietly. Reporters followed him, curious why a young attorney, who had been making headlines in the state capitol, had suddenly turned his attention to a sleepy county diner. Marcus didn't give them details yet, but his presence was enough to spark tension. Officer Pierce noticed, of course. He scoffed when he heard Marcus's name. Another loudmouth lawyer looking for attention. He sneered to his colleagues at the station. Let him try. He'll find out who runs this town. But behind that bravado, unease stirred. Pierce hadn't known who Elaine was, hadn't known that the quiet woman in the corner was mother to a man trained to dismantle the very system Pierce hid behind. The diner incident, once just gossip, became a symbol. Churgors whispered about Elaine's dignity in the face of cruelty. Students at the high school passed around Marcus's speeches online. Realizing the story was bigger than their small town, local activists who had struggled to find traction for years suddenly had a name and a face to rally behind. Tension thickened like storm clouds. On one side, the police closed ranks around Pierce, insisting it was an accident. On the other, Marcus gathered witnesses, statements, and the strength of his mother's silence transformed into testimony. For Elaine, The days grew heavier. She didn't like the spotlight. She still preferred quiet mornings with tea by the window. But each time doubt crept in, she remembered the heat of the coffee, the smirk on Pierce's face, and the weight of Marcus's promise. He picked the wrong woman. And though she feared what might come, she could feel it. The town's balance was shifting. What began as a cruel act in a diner was unraveling into something Pierce had never intended. A confrontation that would test not only him, but the entire system that protected him. The silence was ending, and the escalation was only beginning. The courthouse steps were crowded, something Elaine had never witnessed in her small town. Cameras clicked, microphones angled, and voices shouted questions that hung in the hot air. At the center stood Marcus Carter, his shoulders squared, his jaw set. Beside him, Elaine kept her hands folded, her presence calm but unyielding. This was the breaking point. Marcus had filed an official complaint against Officer Randall Pierce, complete with witness statements from the diner. The young waitress, trembling but resolute, had stepped forward, giving her account to the press. "I saw him pour it. It wasn't an accident. He meant to humiliate her." Others followed. A truck driver at the counter. A mother with her child. They all admitted what they had seen but hadn't stopped. Their silence weighed on them, and Marcus gave them a way to turn that silence into testimony. The police department lashed back immediately. Pierce smirked through press conferences, declaring it a misunderstanding, while his colleagues described him as a respected officer. Behind closed doors, though, the cracks showed. Internal emails leaked, revealing Pierce's history of complaints, all dismissed, all buried. The town was splitting in two. Protesters gathered outside the diner with signs, "Justice for Elaine." Across the street, counter-protesters waved flags and shouted slogans about supporting the badge. Elaine, caught in the storm, carried herself with the same quiet dignity she always had. But the pressure mounted. Strangers called her house, some with encouragement, others with threats. One evening, as Elaine sat at her kitchen table, Marcus placed his hand over hers. His voice was steady, but his eyes burned. "Mom, tomorrow you'll testify. Are you ready?" Elaine looked at him. Her son, once a boy with skinned knees and wide dreams, now a man standing taller than she ever imagined. Her lips curved into a faint smile. "I've been ready my whole life. I just didn't know it." The next day in court, the breaking point arrived. Elaine took the stand. The room hushed. Her voice was soft but carried through the silence. She described the morning at the diner, the heat of the coffee, the smirk on Pierce's face, and the weight of being reduced to nothing in front of a room full of people who did nothing. Then came the moment no one expected. Pierce's attorney sneered, trying to twist her words. "Mrs. Carter, isn't it possible that this was just an accident? That you misinterpreted the officer's actions?" Elaine didn't flinch. She leaned forward slightly, her voice clear. "When a man looks you in the eyes, while pouring hot coffee on your skin, it's not an accident. It's contempt. And I've lived long enough to know the difference." The gallery erupted. Murmurs, gasps, the sound of truth landing like a hammer. Marcus closed his eyes, holding back a tide of emotion. His mother, who had spent her life muted by prejudice, had found her voice in the very place designed to silence her. For Pierce, this was the unraveling. His arrogance cracked as witnesses confirmed her story. His smirk faltered as Marcus dissected his defense with precision. The man who once strutted through the diner now sat cornered, exposed not just as an officer, but as a symbol of unchecked cruelty. The breaking point was not just Elaine speaking. It was the town watching her, perhaps for the first time, not as a quiet black woman to be overlooked, but as a mother whose strength had raised a force powerful enough to shake their foundations. And as she stepped down from the stand, the silence that had once defined her no longer felt like a cage. It felt like the pause before a roar. The aftermath was swift, chaotic, and heavy with consequence. Elaine returned home that evening to find her porch light smashed, A crude message scrawled on the sidewalk in red spray paint, liar. Fear clawed at her chest, but she did not call Marcus. She simply swept the broken glass, washed the paint away with steady strokes, and sat back down with her tea. She knew this fight had a cost. Marcus, however, carried the weight differently. In the courtroom he was fire, measured, relentless, unshakable. But outside, he felt the strain of protecting not just his mother, but the principles he had sworn to uphold. Threatening letters arrived at his office. Online trolls spread rumors. Local officials whispered that he was stirring trouble for his own career. Yet, Marcus pressed forward. Each insult, each attempt to discredit him only deepened his resolve. For Officer Pierce, the consequences came faster than he expected. Internal affairs reopened old complaints. A pattern emerged: excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation. Complaints that had once been silenced under lack of evidence now resurfaced under public scrutiny. Reporters dug deeper, dragging Pierce's reputation into the light. His smirk, once his armor, became his downfall. The town itself began to fracture. Churches divided between those who preached forgiveness for Pierce and those who demanded accountability. Neighbors stopped speaking. Long, buried conversations about race and power surfaced in grocery aisles, barber shops, and classrooms. The coffee incident was no longer just about Elaine. It was about the town's reflection in a cracked mirror. For Elaine, the emotional toll was quieter, but no less profound. She found herself replaying the moment in the diner, not the heat of the coffee, but the silence of the room. That silence cut deeper than the burn. Why didn't anyone stop him? Why did no one stand with me? Those questions haunted her in the night, pressing against the years she had spent enduring, bending, surviving. Yet resilience bloomed in unexpected ways. Strangers sent letters of support. Young people knocked on her door, asking how they could help. The waitress who testified came to visit, tears in her eyes, saying, "You gave me courage. I'll never stay quiet again." Elaine realized that her dignity, once invisible, had become a beacon. The trial reached its climax with Pierce suspended, stripped of his badge pending investigation. The courthouse steps filled again. Protesters on one side chanting, "Justice for Elaine," while Pierce's defenders shouted back with venom. Cameras captured every face, every word, every sign. Through it all, Elaine stood beside Marcus, not hidden, not bowed. Her blouse was plain, her hands steady. She no longer carried the weight of invisibility. The world had seen her. The world had heard her. And for Pierce, the man who thought spilling coffee was nothing more than a cruel amusement, the consequences stretched far beyond a stain on fabric. He had poured contempt on a quiet black woman. And in return, he had unleashed a storm that stripped him bare, exposed his past, and forced an entire town to reckon with its silence. The impact rippled outward, into policies, into conversations, into hearts that could no longer claim ignorance. The consequences were not only his, they belonged to everyone who had ever looked away. The storm did not end with Pierce's suspension. It carried forward, reshaping lives, institutions, and even Elaine herself. Marcus pressed on, filing a civil rights lawsuit, not only against the officer, but against the department that had shielded him for years. The case drew statewide attention. Commentators on television called it a test for justice in small-town America. For Marcus, it was personal. Each legal brief, each argument, each headline was a promise kept to his mother, that her pain would not be dismissed, that her silence would be honored with action. Elaine, meanwhile, discovered a strange transformation within herself. For decades she had chosen invisibility, thinking it was safety. But after testifying, after standing beneath the weight of Pierce's smirk, and refusing to bend, something shifted. At church, she sat in the front pew instead of the back. At the grocery store she looked the cashier directly in the eye. Her quiet was no longer submission, it was strength. And people noticed. One evening, weeks after the hearings, the young waitress who had testified came to visit again. She handed Elaine a notebook, filled with scribbled reflections. "I want to study law," she whispered. Like your son. Like Marcus. Because I saw what silence does, and I don't want to be part of it anymore. Tears welled in Elaine's eyes. She had not just endured, she had inspired. Pierce, stripped of his badge, faced not only trial but isolation. The very town that once cheered his swagger now avoided his gaze. His defenders dwindled as more of his past surfaced, a record too long to ignore. For the first time, he was forced to feel the silence of being unwanted, a silence he had inflicted on others his entire career. Justice did not come as a single thunderclap. It came slowly, deliberately, like rain soaking into dry earth. The lawsuit proceeded. Policy reforms were introduced. Officers faced new accountability measures. And in every discussion, reporters invoked her name, Elaine Carter. The woman who turned humiliation into history. On her porch one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with fire, Elaine sat with Marcus. He looked at her not as a lawyer or advocate, but as a son, the boy she had raised through sacrifice and silence. "You did this, Mom," he said softly. She shook her head. "No, we did this. You spoke, but I lived it." In that moment, the story came full circle. The quiet black woman who had once been overlooked had become the heart of a movement. And the officer who poured coffee on her had unknowingly poured fuel on a fire that would burn far beyond him. Elaine's story was no longer just her own. It belonged to every person who had ever been silenced, every witness who had ever looked away, every young voice learning to speak. She was proof that dignity, though quiet, can roar when the world finally listens. In the end, what happened in that diner was never just about spilled coffee. It was about contempt, silence, and the dangerous comfort of looking away. Officer Pierce thought he was humiliating a woman too quiet to resist. Instead, he exposed himself, and an entire system that had protected him for years. Elaine Carter's strength was never in loudness. It was in the way she endured, the way she raised her son, and the way she carried herself when the world tried to strip her of dignity. Marcus became the voice, but Elaine was the foundation. Together, they reminded a town, and a nation, that justice is not born from silence. It's born when silence is finally broken. This was more than a story about a cruel act in a diner. It was a lesson about resilience, about accountability, and about how the smallest moment of hate can ignite a fire that forces change. This is everyday racism drama.